So hello and welcome back to Unfazed Under Fire. I'm David Craigut, your host and moderator for the show, The Resilient Leadership Guy. Now today we're going to continue on the theme of self-leadership that Anatoly and I spoke about in our last podcast. And to that end, I'm honored to be joined on the show by my good friend Dan Blackburn, who's a fellow executive coach and is an author of a new book, Lost and Found: The Journey to Self-Mastery. Now, Dan was on the show about a year ago, and because he recently released this book focusing on self-mastery, and because I did that other show, I scrambled to reach out to him and say, it would be perfect timing for this, and he moved his schedule in mountains to be on today, so I'm really appreciative of him spending the time. Before writing his book and becoming an executive coach, Dan had an extensive stint in wellness and health, and followed by a 17-year stint as an executive at Whole Foods. In addition to this, he has in addition to his executive coaching business through his company Tula Organizational Wellness, Dan also co-founded a highly respected Tula Yoga Studio, which is a staple for avid Hatha yoga practitioners in the Twin Cities metro area. So Dan, thanks for coming back on the show today. It's really great to have you.
Thanks, David. I forgot I was following Anatoly. That's quite the follow-up. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, it's good. It's perfect. It's perfect. So I appreciate you making the time. So let's jump right in. I mean, I loved your book, and I understand it's kind of an autobiography, right? And can you share a little bit what led you to write Lost and Found, and explain why you chose to write it in the format that you did, the story format?
Yeah. So when I first left Whole Foods Market, and I was doing a lot of executive coaching, and I still am, but the common theme from a lot of people was just that burnout aspect. They had forgotten who they were. They needed to get back to some semblance of balance, which, as you and I know, is never 50-50. It moderates, but they couldn't even figure out what that baseline might be. And it brought me back to where I was when my boys were 6 and 2, and that journey of finding myself and exploring and figuring out, how am I going to live in this space healthy, and actually be around for the long haul, be part of my kids and my wife's actual life, and not just this kind of person that comes in and out of life, is a good provider but not there. So when I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about everything that I've learned through, becoming a yoga therapist, it all kind of came under the umbrella like, oh, I can actually use my story because I've been there. And I really, David, you and I have read a lot of how-to books and some kind of dry coaching books, which I like. I get a lot out of them. But I also really, really, really like a good story. It pulls people in better. They get it from a different part of their brain. And so that's why I wrote it that way.
Well, and I thought your writing was really, really good. It was very entertaining. It was very enjoyable to read. So you're a good writer. I can encourage people to pick up the book more, especially executives out there that are struggling right now. Now, you named the book Lost and Found, and you kind of intimated what that was. But, the title, what was, another way of saying it, what was lost and what was found? Is it something about yourself? You're afraid you were losing yourself in your work, and then somehow there was something you needed to rediscover. Is that kind of the sense of it?
Yeah, absolutely. On that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I literally was lost. I thought that I knew what I was doing, but I wasn't. I was doing my job, but that's all I was doing. Me as a person was lost, and being able to find that person again and actually be a partner to my wife and a husband and a father to my kids, but also really a better, I hate to use the word boss, but a better leader, somebody that was actually present and not a commander in chief kind of a person that
right.
The command and control kind of person who I had come from and really wasn't happy with. I just couldn't figure out how to get around it.
Well, where did the command and control kind of sense come from? Did it just come from the conditioning of our society and how you were trained? Is that fundamentally where that came from?
Part of it came from my wife, not my wife, sorry, from my father.
You're gonna have to pay for that one.
She is far from that. But part of it
Yeah,
came from my father. I mean, I went into the Marine
yeah,
Corps when I was young. Um,
yeah,
the the tools that I had learned was, and what I was taught, even in leadership, was do what I tell you to do. And
yeah,
when somebody would say, "Why aren't you getting this done?" I took personal responsibility, which you know kind of forced it. The old expression, "Shit rolls downhill." It's like I forced it downhill,
yeah.
and you know I I got results, but I also lost people. So the results that would be repeated became harder and harder to come by. These were kind of one and done things, and I wasn't celebrating those wins. I wasn't developing good leaders that could
Yeah.
lead their team. I was developing people who wanted to be that same command and control, which is a pretty narrow view of execution of orders. It doesn't develop leaders.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't spawn creative, critical thinking. Was what you want. You want them to be creative and surprise you, right? Versus
Right.
and it's true. If you command and control, if you dictate, and many leaders that we've come across even use fear to motivate.
Big time.
You just create all kinds of messes and passive aggressiveness and all kinds of weird things, right?
And then you got to
Well,
clean it up.
yeah, then you got to clean it up. Well, and at the outset of the story, you introduce a another character becomes a key person for you in the book named River. So who does River represent in this journey, and what is his ultimate purpose in the story?
So River, this is so funny. So I got to tell you that when I first introduced River to my editor, they did not like the name. It was too like hippie-ish. But I I really wanted the name because a river transforms the landscape. And here I
Right.
was, this kind of rock hard person that needed some transformation. So the metaphor fit for me. And as far as people, you know, there are so many teachers, mentors, partners that I've had that when I started listening to those voices, they were kind of stored inside me and started seeing what they were really saying or how it affected me personally. River became a conglomerate of all of those people and really everything that was inside of myself, things that I knew to be true that I just wasn't listening to before. And and so that's pretty much it. It's like the having a good conversation with somebody, a mentor or an elder that you hear them in the moment, but don't act on it. But somewhere in
Yeah.
there, it's
There's a
there,
voice.
right? The voice is there. And so for whatever reason, that when I started to listen to those things, like I could hear those voices and I could
Yeah.
even see what they meant.
Yeah.
And then I started to apply it, and it brought me to even more research, which met, River got expanded in his views, and so yeah,
Yeah, very good. So he's a conglomerate of all those lessons that we learn in life, and he's kind of the holds that space for that in the book,
yeah,
right? You know,
yeah.
yeah,
And for me, gosh, in the 1950s or 60s, this conversation might have happened at a bar with a bartender,
yeah,
but
right,
nowadays, and for me especially, sitting next to somebody with a cup of tea, cup of coffee, some kind of a healthy beverage or whatever, and having a really good conversation. I mean, that's where whole worlds are born. It's
we need
so,
more. We need more of that in the world. We need that happening a lot more. I mean,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. Well, in the beginning of the book, you do this job of painting a picture of this exhausted, burnt out executive, and I think you did a really good job of like almost collapsing into the camp that you went to. It took you a few days to shake it off, and you did a really good job of describing that. let's talk about this corporate grind that's out there that's still, and it seems to me, I think we talked about this on the last show, it seems to me that executives are busier than they've ever been. They're being pushed harder. And not only that, they're having to deal with all kinds of things they didn't deal with pre-pandemic, before the pandemic. I don't know what that is. Something changed. And it just seems... So what do you think has to change in organizations for executives to have greater impact, as you point to? It's because it's not like command and control doesn't give you the impact. It's short-term, long-term pain. Short-term benefit, long-term pain. There's a different way of doing things that may, in the short term, take effort, but creates long-term momentum, right? But what do you think has to change in the corporate environment for executives to have the impact they have, but also to experience greater joy and fulfillment in their lives? What do you think has to happen?
Yeah. So for me, David, I think, if we look back at the short history when the pandemic happened and there was the quote unquote grand resignation, which to me was just like, it was going to happen. It just all happened at once because corporations or big businesses weren't in alignment with what was coming up in the world. And they weren't really taking much time to develop that relationship anymore and get, people to really communicate as teams and celebrate as teams and work as teams to fundamentally be part of the business that they were in. So whenever it started, I couldn't actually tell you when it started, but we started to separate the people from the business again and keep them in their own silos, not involve them in, you don't have to go through a P&L with everybody, but
Right.
it does actually help to say, listen, here's the work that you're doing. Here's how it contributes to the bottom line. Here's what we're giving back to you. So it starts to become more of a
Right.
well-informed base of employees that they can start to get attached, or not necessarily attached, but really involved with the mission of the company. And often that is overlooked these days, and it's even worse now because after those bunch of people left, everything got stuck in the hands of these executives to get done. Well, they don't know how to do it anymore. They've been out of that field if they were ever trained in it in the first place. So it became command and control. You got to do this, which then again separates those people even more from their leaders. And to me, fundamentally, that's what's happened here is that leadership is, if they're leaders at all anymore, have become much more managers, and they are separated from their team. And so what has to happen is to bring them back. Let's have a whole unit. Let's start to understand how we communicate with each other. Start to, not everybody on your team is going to stay with you for 20 years. That's almost impossible these days. But you can help them get where they want to go as long as it's, also there's some reciprocity there. They can help you and your team move forward, and everybody learns from each other, and we grow as a unit. So it's kind of a long-winded answer. I hope that made sense.
Well, no, I know. It says that. I even look at, I don't want to overuse sports analogies, but if you look at good NFL teams, the ones that do the best player development, it seems like they lose 15 players a year to other teams in free agency. But then they restock again because they're developing people. They're developing players, and they're happy for the players that are. They're happy for the players that move on. You're not part of. You're making more money. We'll just develop players from the. And so that's an example of it. It's like when you're developing people, not only are you doing good for your organization, and you're creating a strategy that's a long-term maximization of the beautiful talent that's coming into your organization. You're also making the world a better place. You're sprinkling seeds everywhere when they go out. And they're also not going to pull it up with the corporate grind as much, because if they don't have that experience there, they're going to be more demanding when they go to other organizations. So they're going to be a positive influence in the world, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I like what you said there. It's about making the world a better place, just like the sports teams that develop the teammates. They're making the sport better in the long run.
Yes. Yeah.
And if it's all about the individuals, that sport's going to die.
Yeah.
And that's
absolutely.
just the way it is.
Well, and this kind of brings me back to kind of the first scenes in the book when River's talking and he's sharing, you're sharing your plight as that exhausted executive. And he shares, among other things, the 5 major causes of suffering, right? I don't
Yeah.
want to give all those away so could people read the book, but what had you start with? You can name them if you want or whatever you want to do with that, but what had you start with that? What was your thoughts on that foundation in the book? Just
Yeah. When I started writing it and I thought, okay, how the hell did I get here in the first place? And I'm having this conversation with River, and the only thing I could say is naming number one, wouldn't have got me there. It was like, okay, that's a little too soft. It's a bit of a softball. But that second one, you know, really that false sense of self, so to speak, and you really
yeah,
just bought in. That was where I
that,
was. And
yeah.
so that's why I started with that. I started with number two, worked my way through five, and then backed up to number one to say,
One,
okay,
right.
let's look at the beginning because
I like
it's a
that because I was actually reading the book saying number 2, where's number 1? I was actually in that same. And then I went back pages. I said, where's the number? I missed it. I misread it. And so you had me, and then I was like, oh, there's number 1. And now and then it made sense what you're just saying about why you started with number 2, because it
yeah,
really is. That is the core when you coach somebody, when you're coming into coaching. If somebody hasn't had an executive coach before, and they're coming to me and they haven't done much development, and they might have a spiritual or whatever, they've been some Tony Robbins things or whatever they've done, but not a lot. Am I going to start with team leadership, how to become a team leader or how to be a great leader in your organization? That would be foolish, because the true core of it, and this is what gets to the highlights that Anatoly and I spoke in the last podcast about, and you share in one of the first things actually River says in the book is you can't lead others until you know how to lead yourself. And there later in the book you have a quote from the Bhagavad Gita: yoga is a journey of the self, through the self, to the self. And the wake up as you're mentioning that is when you're exhausted. You're like you're working, you lose yourself in your job, you forget about yourself. I hear this all the time. Like, why am I showing up to work every day? What the
hmm
heck am I doing here every day? And I make a lot of money. I like my team, but sometimes trying to understand what we're doing here. Now, I'm not saying that people are they're that overly that confused, but we have days like that. Let's put it that
yeah,
way. And one of the first recognitions, right, is that I've been trying to be something other than I am. At one
yeah,
point in my life, I was innocent and playful and having fun and creating, and somehow I lost that, right?
hmm
And so, do you is your view of self mastery and self leadership? Do you see them as like synonyms in a certain way?
yes, I do. And I also want to recognize that it never ends, right?
Yeah,
We can't go back on automatic pilot and say we've accomplished this because we'll be right back at the beginning. And
right.
but those are the same things. And maybe we're a master of self for a split second, but it never ends.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really beautiful to see that this recognition is beginning to show up in so many places. I mean, it used to be in the bastion of spirituality, but now, if you've heard of internal family systems therapy, and Dick Schwartz, who created that, he basically says we become these multiplicity of parts that express and are triggered in different ways. And he talks about the core self in the same way that the Bhagavad Gita talks about the core
hmm
self, or some of the mystics have talked about it. And physics talks about that the same way. And neuroscience has found out that we have these two brains, and one is more creative and core, and another one is more survival. So we're starting to see a triangulation of understanding, which is an exciting time to be alive. And what we're trying to do, and certainly what I'm trying to do, I think what you're trying to do in our work is re-enliven that in our clients, right?
Yeah,
That what you need is truly inside you with these qualities that exist already. You've gotten away from the treasure house And it's kind of like, you've been on this journey like the prodigal son and went away from the riches to try, just give me my inheritance now, Dad. I'll go out and just enjoy life. I'll get it early. And he found out that was thank God his father welcomed him back, right? But anyway, so what I'm getting, what I'm intimating from what you're saying and what was said in the book, beyond improving one's ability to lead others, self-leadership or mastery ultimately provides us with so much more. Mm-hmm. So what would you say it brings to our daily lives in general as you gain more connection to yourself and gain more mastery? What does it bring into our lives or bring back into our lives?
So I want to jump back a little bit on something you just said. So, those two things, right? The joy, which really brings us to the front of our brain. And then, or the fear, or, that survival mode, which keeps us in the back.
Right.
And those studies have actually shown that the more you exercise the front, that creative space, the more gray matter grows there to support that. Whereas if we're stuck in the past or stuck in that survival mode, which is the past, that's where we stay. That's our brain.
That is cool. I hadn't heard that research.
It's pretty wild. So the more we practice that, and that's why the rare moments, right? The more we can practice being present fully, the more we're actually going to get out of the day. The more we're actually going to see our place, not only in society as it is, but in our family and in the places that we choose to be. We're actually going to be, rather than just a kind of a seat that somebody sits in but nobody recognizes because there's nobody really there. And so to me, when we're really practicing getting into the present, being in that creative self, like sense of play, and truly getting out of survival mode, then we can actually be here and now. We can make the world a better place instead of just a place to survive, which are very different skills, right? If you're going to survive, you build a fort and sharpen knives. If you're going to play, you go out and interact with your neighbors. And that's a very different thing.
Yeah, we have a lot of people that are pressing in the back of their brain right now, right? Because this is why it's so important right now to get this work out into the world and help people understand it, because what we're seeing on the news is instilling the back of the brain. It's reinforcing the back of the brain, the belief that half our country is whatever, and we have to be on guard now. Half the country is dangerous. We have to be on guard for the rest of the enemy. And that just is, and you wonder if, I don't know, I'm not going to say whether it's being done on purpose or not, but the main thing is, the other thing is, you said, pointed that I love this research. It completely makes sense to me because it speaks to the whole notion that what we focus on grows. And literally, this is gray matter grows based on how we focus. And I always talk about, well, you can focus on vision and creating, or you can collapse into current reality. So the first one is the creative front part of the brain, and the second is survival and fear, right? And so it's like it's all these things. It's great. That's great.
And you're also kind of creating a gap then, which for coaches is great. Okay, how do we get to this vision? I mean, you're here. If you want to stay here in that past limbic system, I can't help you because that's you're already there. You're already a master at that. How do we get here to the future, to play?
Yeah. Well, and this is like, this also reminds me of the part of the book where, you're just about to go home from vacation and River is sharing Aristotle's quote, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit." He then asked you to consider what you're aiming for and to look at your strongest habits and see if you're doing what's serving your definition of excellence. And to me, the core of understanding what we aim to do and why we're here, who we are, our identity, like who am I, right? Why are we here, our purpose, and what's most important to us, our values, and holding ourselves accountable to that is what life is about in a certain way. And discovering what those things are is part of the fun. Now, as we saw in the story, this is what I wanted to ask you, and you get your point on this, articulating the vision is easy. That's the fun part, right? It's the fun part is saying, getting down, and sometimes you're still asking clients, so have you done that reflective exercise? They hadn't gotten to it yet. But when they do, they usually get charged up and excited. But that's the simple part, right? The activating of it is not so easy, right? And that's where we talk about self-mastery. So Dan, what makes that so difficult? I guess if it was easy, everybody would do it, right? But what makes it so difficult to turn a vision of our highest and best selves into reality? What's the challenges we face?
This is the challenge. You're absolutely right. And there's a couple of things that are in my mind that are happening here. One is, we are a product of who we've imagined ourselves to be at this point in time, right? It's these habits. So we're a product of our habits every day. We're also living in a world who sees us as those habits. And when we start to expand our vision or start to change that vision, there's resistance everywhere within ourselves and everywhere around us, because they've been able to trust who you are at this point. They might not like it, but they can at least trust your habits are regular. They can adapt or compensate or however they want. You or myself has learned how to adapt and compensate using the habits that I have. But if I have a different vision or I want to evolve in some way, then really I have to let go of some of those things that have kept me there or supported me in that old vision, create some new things, which means I start to become a new person, not only to myself, but in the eyes of everyone around me.
Absolutely.
And it's much easier to stay in your own lane, just do what you've always done. It's back to science. We know that the brain takes up 20% of your energy, 2% of your weight, 20% of your energy. So if you're and so we have these habits to actually save energy. That way you can do other things with your mind. But now we're saying to the mind, wait a minute, we're creating some new habits. Well, the mind is going to basically say, are you effing kidding me here? I'm going to start making you tired. I'm going to make you angry. I'm going to make you upset in any way possible, because I brought you here. Like, I created these habits for you to stay safe. And now you're telling me you don't want them anymore. It's like this whole internal dialogue. So that's part of what makes it so hard. On the other hand, if we can lean into that and be curious and laugh at it, it does start to become fun. Like you're on a treasure hunt, finding the real you.
Yeah, it's true. It is a treasure hunt. And the thing is that it's what I want to tell the listeners, you're guaranteed, if you stay on that hunt and you have good guidance, you will find treasure beyond your wildest imagination. And this is sometimes what I love to see in clients. Obviously, there's the awakenings that happen and the recognitions. Oh, it could be a lot easier than the way I've been doing it. And I tried that and it does work. Or taking some time to take breaks during the day makes me more productive, not less, Things, just simple things that can happen. But,
to your earlier point, David, the person who just said, hey, can I just have the money to, well, he didn't work for it.
Yeah.
Right. So he never earned it.
Right.
And that's the thing about, changing your habits, creating this world, you got to do the work. Just like you as a coach, you can't just give somebody the answer, because they're not going to earn the reward and it won't stay.
Well, and this speaks to a little bit of, Anatoly, and just to mention him real briefly, we noticed in the beginning of doing the resilient leadership method, where he does his process of relieving people of their trauma and so forth, that people that got it quickly, because it's only 2 1-hour sessions, right? Mm-hmm. And they had this amazing opening, but then they didn't work it. And they kind of started wondering what happened. And then, they go on vacation, they report, oh, it's back, because they got so busy and they used kind of all the energy they got to do more of what they were doing before. So that's why we had to kind of started deploying coaching in that process, because it really had to slow people down and appreciate what they got, right? Because if it comes too easy, we have to work for it a little bit, right? We have to appreciate it and do that research a little bit. Now, in the book, going back to the book, as it happens, it just so happens that River happens to live in your city. Well, we met him at this camp, and he happens to be in St. Paul, and he runs a coffee shop called the Karmic Bean, right? So that's just amazing. When you meet the teacher, they're also convenient. There's a convenience factor there. But for the first meeting and over the course of the book, he becomes a guide on your quest, as you mentioned, to find what you lost. And as you have insights and obstacles, you get to meet him, as you said earlier, like for those different, he would make you different kinds of coffees and teas, and you would talk about, and you would sit and talk to him and have these amazing conversations. And one of the first assignments that River gives you that relates to this habit change process is that you're at the company. He gives you the RARE process. It's an acronym for Reflective Awareness Response Exercise. And I think this would be a good one to share with the audience, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little tidbit for the book about, you know, you framed your sense of self, your ideal self. You've done that, right? You got an idea of who you want to become more of or be more of. You've got these habits that are staring you in the face, that are making you tired and making it difficult on you to change the habits to be consistent with that. And so I think this exercise fits in there, right, as a one way to engage it. So if you could talk a little bit about the exercise and what you suggest clients do with it, it might be a good one that could be a takeaway for people today.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the number one things that I was doing was I would get up out of bed and I was at work before I thought about anything. Like, never taking the time to acknowledge that, I just had this great night's sleep, or I didn't, what happened, never setting my intentions for the day. It was just go to work, like get things done. So when I started to actually sit down, find your breath, find a good, steady, easy breath so you can get back in, instead of jumping out with that energy and just getting to work. That's my survival brain. Like, how can I sit down for a moment and really be present with the day, set some intentions, and then reflect on how my sleep was, all those other things. I started to say, okay, I can do this. And I started to do it twice a day. So in the morning, I'd get up and ask, and it'll kind of come through a little bit as we go along. But I'd wake up and say, okay, how was my sleep the night before? Just to acknowledge what it was. What are my intentions for the day? And how do I want to celebrate it when I come home? Those kinds of things. So basically just 3-4 questions that are going to be, who do I want to be today? What kind of a value do I want to show up as? Am I going to be playful? Am I going to be a dick, for lack of better words? And so I could actually set the intention before I even left the house, before I ate breakfast, before I did anything, and just like, okay, let's sit down and do this. It takes 2 minutes. Like, it's not much time at all. And obviously, you can write it down, which is better if you do. Then you can actually have that memory for you stored on a piece of paper instead of in your brain, so you don't have to think about it. And then at night, I'd come home and say, okay, well, how was my day? What did I observe? Notice those things. And so, how did that feel in my body? But then also set the intentions for the night. What kind of a dream? Who do I want to be in my dreams tonight? So I'm constantly setting those intentions, bringing those values back in. Yeah. And that way, I wouldn't. It was interesting because when I first started, I'm sure that when you're really into something and you're kind of hyper anxious and not taking very good care of yourself, your sleep is like
not great.
There's no way of nourishing yourself in that time. And that was a big deal for me. Like, I slept 4.5 hours a night and thought I was doing great. But then I started to actually sleep a little bit more with a little bit more quality, not so restless, and things started to shift. So those just twice a day is all you need. Now, I did it even during the middle of the day when I'd start thinking, am I actually being the values that I set out to be? What does it feel like in my body? Get the breath back in, get more present to who I want to be. Again, it's 2 minutes. Like, it's not much time.
Yeah, not much time at all. Well, and again, and I think in the book, River talks about the benefits of that, the expanded self-awareness, being more observant of yourself and others, especially when you're remember you talk about being interactions with people in the stores and how you found this greater relaxation and spaciousness opening up to you. And I'm just thinking about, you say that to an executive, spaciousness and relaxation. How is that going to help? No, I mean, I'm being facetious, but in a certain way,
You're
we
absolutely
want to
right.
enhance performance and foster accountability. What are you talking about? So, how does spaciousness and relaxation enhance performance and accountability for those people looking for ROI, right?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I'm going to answer it in a couple of different ways. One is, when we get in that reaction space, we usually get up in our upper chest, right? We start
Right.
breathing shallow, little hypertension exists. Well, the stress response in our body tells us we need to survive back into that limbic system, right? We haven't got the ability to process then. So if we can allow ourselves to take that couple of minutes, let the body settle, bring the breath down into the central diaphragm instead of into here, then when we're in that kind of open, relaxed space, we don't actually have to know everything, which is something executives really need to know is you don't have to be the answer machine here. There's
Yeah.
more truth out there than you could possibly
Yeah.
imagine.
That's so true. Yeah. That's a
So,
major leadership lesson. Yeah.
yeah, so how can you open yourself up to that? To not have to be the one to have the answer and to acknowledge people that do and then spread it out. Well, that only happens when you're kind of looser and more able to interact with people without having that defensive shield up.
Well, I mean, I think, as leaders being creators, one of their primary jobs, and I think it's one of the key jobs, is to create an environment that brings out the best in others and service to what you're up
Yes.
to, right? So their job is not to know all the answers. And I think we've been trained in our own educational system. It's the answers are more important than the questions. But in leadership, the questions are more important than the answers. Because fundamentally, one person can't come. I don't care how smart you are. And I've met some. I mean, most people I coach are like 10 times smarter than I am. They
Hmm.
can, they could, they can overanalyze me on a number of fronts. But you can't figure everything out, and also you get contracted in your own little world, and you can't be
Yes.
creative. And when you create
Back
an
into that
environment where
survival.
you present the problem to the team, say, what should we do about this? It opens up something in them too, right?
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
And so in the book I talk about the concept of there's like three main things. The very beginning is there's nonviolence, right? So are we being violent to ourselves and how does that reflect in how we treat others? What is truth? And if our truth is all we're really dealing with, like where there's no room for any other truth, there's a problem there. And then there's the boundaries and the agreements that we make with each other. Um, and I call that not stealing from each other or yourself. So those three like tenets um, are the first three major steps on starting self mastery. But it all starts with that um, non-violence towards yourself, and you know, being in that stuck,
Yeah.
stressed. That is just. I still get there. Like you can't really avoid it. You're gonna
Right.
have stress in your life. It's the idea is to how to get out of it in a way that's so it's not controlling you,
Right.
you
First,
know?
how to recognize you're in stress, right? Because
Yes,
that's the thing. That's the thing that burnout executives figure out too late, right?
they do.
And they're not recognizing the value of self care. And what you're pointing to is self compassion.
Hmm.
And again, this goes back to like Dick Schwartz's work at IFS. He talks about there's no bad parts. There's nothing bad in you. And he says one of the things that any modality that has you be tough on yourself and push yourself to the limit is not an effective modality for changing
Hmm.
and transforming anything. It's really through self compassion and self care that we create the environment within us to do the same to others and to create a possibility that's greater than ourselves, right? And it goes back to
That's the
listening
ticket.
and all that, right?
Mhm.
Right? Right?
Yeah, and and it does create kind of a I don't know a repeat cycle, if you will, because if you're the one that has to have the answers, then you're the one that's accountable for them, and then you don't really want to be accountable for them because it's other people's fault, and it becomes this weird, there's no way you can balance all that. Whereas if your intention really is to grow the human into being, not only better at their job but better at being a human being, well, that's a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah, it's a very amazing thing. And again, it's, you see when people relax and they do find that greater spaciousness in themselves. There's a lightness of being that happens, and people notice that.
They
Versus,
do.
if you're very intense, and I think you're an 8 on the Enneagram, is that right? Is that
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So you learn that big time, right?
Yep.
Your intensity can rub off on other people, right? So, and we all have our own version of that we can do. But when we're relaxed and spacious in our hearts, and we're breathing,
Yeah. It always reminds
and
me of,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but it reminds me of
no, please,
Ben, that movie Ben-Hur,
yeah,
and it's the end, right? And they're having the race, and Ben-Hur, at least the Charlton Heston version, he's just kind of, getting those horses to go, where you have the Roman guy, I can't remember what his name is, but he is just whipping those horses. Well, Charlton Heston wins, at least in that version. I know there's another version, but I haven't seen it. Anyway, it's kind of that whole thing, like the horses know, your team members know who's in charge that day, that shift. They know when you're not. And
right,
so, they're going to compensate in ways that help them survive an environment and if you're treating them poorly, they're going to compensate in other ways, not so healthy. If you're treating them well, generally speaking, 99% of the time, they're going to respect that and pay it back.
yeah. And your point, like I'm thinking about, like, busy executives, and a big thing you hear is they don't have time for this, they don't have time for that. But you're not talking about a lot of time. For the investment you do make. Let's say you start your day off with 5 minutes of reflection and writing for intentions, and you spend 15 minutes meditating, and you do the same at night,
Yeah.
and you're checking in mindfully throughout the day. You're talking about less than an hour a day that probably returns hours back to you, and
Yep.
more insight, more creativity, because you're tapping into that part of yourself that is already creative, spacious, centered, confident. The more you're giving it space, it comes forward, and obviously you have to change some habits and all that kind of stuff along the way. So there is work involved, but there is real. There's this quote, and I love you to dissect this one just a little bit for me, from Thich Nhat Hanh, you have in the
Hmm.
book, that I really liked. That I thought you would, of anybody, you would be able to help us understand this one. It says, "Breath is the bridge which connects life to consciousness, which unites your body to your thoughts." So I think we've kind of been talking about that, but anything you would say about what that means to you, what that quote means to you,
Yeah.
that breath being the
So
bridge.
the bridge. So to me, I'm gonna mix it up a little bit. So here we have our head, right? It's often not present. It's usually there or it's, somewhere else. It's in the future, it's in the past. But our body, our lived experience is right here, right? It's not going anywhere else. This is where it's at. And so if we can allow the mind to kind of make best friends with the breath so that you're allowing the body now to really do its job, let the central diaphragm do its job. As a total side note, did you know you have basically three diaphragms in the body, not just one?
No, I didn't realize that.
So the central diaphragm, this is anatomically, the central diaphragm and the pelvic floor diaphragm work as one. So as the central diaphragm draws down, the pelvic floor kind of catches it like a trampoline and then it draws it back up. Now, under stress, the central diaphragm freezes because we use it as a brace, so to speak, which means that our pelvic floor diaphragm isn't doing any work, and all the work is coming up here into our scalenes and neck. Well, that's not doing anybody any good because it forces us back into that survival mode of the brain, not an embodied experience. So if we can use the breath low and slow to start to let the mind kind of travel with that breath down into the body, feel what's going on and let it go, we can start to use that as a metaphor for all kinds of things. Like, what are we bringing into our life from the world around us? what are we letting go? And also to remember, there's the expression of, you know, water today was once a diaphragm or a dinosaur's, urine. If you look at the air, like that is a blend of everybody else and every other thing in the world around us. And we're bringing that in to
We're
our body.
unifying. We're
Yep.
unifying. Yeah.
Unifying and mixing it with our own and letting that out into the world. So to me, there's
Yeah.
no better analogy of what that means. It's just, you know, so hard to just like, okay, give me just a minute. I need to just breathe and process this,
Yeah.
settle it down. Taking it, you can take it in a car, you can take it wherever you are.
You could start a meeting with breath work, right? You know, like
I
what could
often
that
do.
could yeah, and you do. I mean, because what I hear you saying in the first part of that is essentially the breath is the bridge. It's bringing it's bringing your mind into the moment. The body is already there. It never leaves the moment. It's
Yes.
always present. And you're conjoining and I can see the bridge now. You're joining with your body and you're slowing yourself down so your mind can be present. Is that fair
Yeah,
to say? Yeah.
totally fair. And in the physical practice, what I often think about, if somebody's having a really hard time with their neck, it's often because their fantasy land and their reality are just not lining up for large parts of their
Oh my
life.
gosh.
And they're
Yeah.
holding it in like there's no bridge or it's out,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
So
I worked with this guy Stuart Heller, who was a tattoo 6 degree black belts in martial arts. He was an operations researcher and had a background in engineering. He was a very interesting guy, and he would talk a lot about how the body he could look at somebody's body and tell you their whole story because
isn't
our
that
body
amazing?
does. Yeah, he could tell if somebody's neck was leaning forward, he said, "You race around. You're always ahead of yourself, aren't you?" And he could see it. So it's funny. Our body does form with how we live life, and you can see it in people's physical experience. That's really
Hmm.
great to bring that in. Well, tell me a little bit, just to help the audience kind of understand the main character's ultimate transformation. You know, what how does the character ultimately evolve in the book, and what lessons are most relevant, do you think, to the leadership development journey for most executives? If you could pick one, or I'm sure there's more than one or two, but if you could pick one or two ways in which the character evolves in the book, that's relevant, most relevant to as you're doing these things, these practices, and what happens for the character in their work in the book.
Yeah. So one of the things you just talked about, your body really does form to what you're doing. And that's earlier we talked about why is it so hard to change these things? Well, part of it is because your body is formed to what you were doing. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is really allowing those pieces of your body to let go, allowing
Yeah.
you can call it trauma or whatever, but the stored memory in your body to let that go, which is really harder than it seems. And there's always like this residual, um, underlying programming
Memory.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah, the memory. So it's not that you just let it go once because it's going to come up. It wants to survive by itself to help you survive. That's its habit. So it's really understanding how that piece kind of comes in and letting that go. And for me, it was the evolution of what really do I need to let go of in order to find this other life and let it be created. And I think that's the ultimate part of this book is, we have been given and formed our habits, which really helped us survive our childhood into young adulthood. And there's a belief system, but it's limiting and it's limiting us. On the other, to grow though, we have to break through that limiting belief system in order to grow beyond it. And that means we got to let go of all kinds of things that are holding us in place right now. And so to me, that was the evolution of who I was. And that person is still here,
Right.
but I've it becomes less and less and less
Right.
of me,
Right.
although I can appreciate where it was, where how I got here and be thankful. I
Yeah.
wouldn't have survived had I not had those skills. And it prevented me from growing into the bigger me that you see today before you.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we there's a quote in 12 steps, I don't regret the past, right? Don't regret the past. And I think it's we become who we are, and our gifts have come through even our traumas and what
Hmm.
we've learned from them, not just our trauma. So the development of us as human beings in facing those limiting beliefs and overcoming them is the biggest gift we have to give to the world, just like you did in Lost and Found. Your gift came from your suffering and overcoming it through your own process and finding the rivers that you found, in your life to teach you. Because I think all of us have this longing that we've been all given. And sometimes that gets weighted down and we lose touch with it. But what I see, and you sometimes see this in clients when you're working with them and they start working, this glimmer of, oh my God, I'm excited to be in this conversation. I think it's to become a better leader, but there's something more to this because we're
Hmm.
giving them permission to step back and self explore and get in touch with their core selves in some small way or big way, depending on the situation. And that's really the gift, right? Because then once we see that, we can explore what the gifts are. But that tends to, what's the quote? The way out is through. You can't just skirt around or
Right.
bypass the healing. And it,
Yeah.
it, it is through the process of healing that the gifts emerge, right? It is through the process of healing that the treasure comes forward. So,
Yeah. The
yeah.
treasure. And that's absolutely right, David. That's absolutely right. There is an abundance of treasure within all of us. And, you know, there's another expression in the book. We're all just walking each other home here. And if we
Mm-hmm.
could use that, and realize that, this person's coming from their background, their experience, their
Yeah, yeah,
contained
exactly.
belief system. And you can reject it, you can learn from it. There's choices.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You have, it's just, yeah, when you start talking to people about why they believe what they believe, you start realizing that people are more similar than different than you. We're
Yes.
all we're all looking for that, sense of self and joy that comes from connecting to that.
Mhm.
That's the simplest way you can put it. There's more to it than that, but we're all, that's at our core. We're the same, right? In that way, and community. And you look at community and friendships and having coffees together and having conversations together. It's not so much the words. What do you walk away with from those coffees and those teas? Is it's not that I don't remember what people say, but it's the feeling of being connected
Yeah.
and expanded and validated and validating another person. And we need more of that in the world. And I think we're at a low in community right now and connectivity, but I think that's coming back. It's got to because that's who we are as a species. Connection is so critical to us,
You're
and that's
absolutely
what I
right.
want. That's what I want to see is greater union in the world, not division. Right? That's what we all want.
Yeah.
Well, as we close out the today's show, we could go on again and for another hour. But do you have anything else you'd like to share about the book, its messages, or anything you would want to people to walk away from reading it? Any final thoughts?
Um, one, thanks for this opportunity. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And then as
Yeah,
far as the book, read it, send me a message, ask questions. I mean, that's what that book, I put that book out there to help people. That's the whole
yeah,
intention. Like, you got questions, my contact information is in the book. Send them to me and
yeah.
we'll have a conversation.
Great, great. Well, I want to really thank you, Dan, for joining, taking the time to be with us today and sharing more about your book and your work. And I do believe this work of self mastery or self leadership is the most important development arena for executives today. and there's so much noise on the outside, and much of what we hear seems to conflict. It's all confusing, and the times are just kind of disheartening at times. Just gets disheartened. Yet, as paradoxical as it is so true. When we become quiet, we remain aware, we engage our body, mind, emotional states in an integrated way, and take time to ask ourselves some deeper questions. As we've talked about a number of times, the answers are there. And once, so we all have this sense of being lost, but we can be found by looking within and get some support from reading a book like yours. And the answers come forward, and it's not confusing at all. A lot of times we've all had moments of crystal clarity, and it doesn't come from reading a bunch of books. It comes in the moment when you're ready, right?
Yeah.
So again, I want to thank you for joining us today and appreciate you joining us. And to my listeners, if you find these podcasts insightful and inspiring, please share them with those. This is what this podcast is about. As Dan said in his book, is trying to help leaders become more effective and resilient, creative, and to enjoy life more and have greater well-being. So if you have any suggestions or for future topics or guests, please email me. I'll put my email address at the bottom of this podcast. You can just send me an email with those. And finally, below this podcast, you'll also find Dan's contact information and a link to the Amazon to order his book. It's an extremely insightful and enjoyable read. I can't recommend it more. So thanks again for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. And this is David Kragos, the Resilient Leadership Guy, signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Take care.
You bet. It was fun.